All right, so Joe Biden has released some more of the details as to what he wants to include in this next big infrastructure package that Democrats are going to be focusing on trying to pass. They're probably going to have to use the process of budget reconciliation with the 50-50 split in the Senate. You're not going to get 10 votes on a good infrastructure package with Republicans, period. So they're going to have to use the process of budget reconciliation. And so because of that, you're only having to work within the scope of the Democratic Party, the farthest right obviously being like Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema and Joe Biden himself. That's the farthest right that we will have to be conversing with in this whole debate. But Joe Biden put forward what his suggestion is for this plan, and it is embarrassingly inadequate. Embarrassingly inadequate, okay? White House unveils $2 trillion infrastructure and climate plan, setting up a giant battle over size and cost of government. Ahead of his speech in Pittsburgh, Biden administration releases a sprawling effort to revamp U.S. transit, broadband, housing, and more. So, $2 trillion. I mean, this is embarrassing, okay? Joe Manchin, like I was just saying, the farthest right person who you are going to have to negotiate with in this entire process, is suggesting a $4 trillion investment. Joe Manchin wanted a $4 trillion investment in this. Why are you coming to the table, Joe Biden, with a suggestion that is lower than what the farthest right conservatives within your own party are asking for? This is, like I said, this is embarrassingly inadequate. And it's not just embarrassing in the sense that he's not pushing hard enough against some of these conservative aspects within his own party. It's embarrassing when you look at what our infrastructure needs right now. So our infrastructure frequently by the American Society of Civil Engineers has been graded at like a D plus to recently, I think they upgraded it to a C minus. So embarrassing, okay? We are the wealthiest nation in the history of the world, and our infrastructure is crumbling, and we're not prepared. Our infrastructure is not prepared to handle climate change and the effects that are going to come from climate change. So what does the American Society of Civil Engineers say about this issue? So they say we're going to need around a $4.59 trillion investment by 2025. And that's what it's going to take to bring our infrastructure up to a grade of a B. Of a B. So roughly $5 trillion by 2025 is needed in order to get our infrastructure to a grade of a B. Okay? I don't want our infrastructure to just be a B. Not only do I not want it to be failing or close to failing with the grade of a D minus or a D plus or C minus, I want us to have A plus infrastructure. I want us to lead the world in our infrastructure that the rest of the world envies. That's what I want for the United States moving forward with infrastructure. So if the American Society of Civil Engineers is saying we need close to $5 trillion invested over the next 5 years, then why would Joe Biden be only suggesting $2 trillion over the next 10 years? Over the next 10 years. That's like what, $200 billion, roughly around that same, that amount per year? Like a third of our military budget? Are you goddamn out of your mind? I mean, this is embarrassing. Here's what AOC had to say about it. This is not nearly enough. The important context here is that it's $2.25 trillion spread out over 10 years. For context, the COVID package was $1.9 trillion for this year alone, with some provisions lasting 2 years. It needs to be way bigger. So yeah, that's an understatement. It needs to be way bigger. We just spent $2 trillion a year on COVID relief. That was supposed to last 1 year. Like she said, many of the things within the COVID packages, and we didn't even get monthly checks. We didn't even get the full $2,000 checks that Democrats promised. And still, that was $2 trillion for 1 year. And that was just a band-aid on the bigger problem. So when you start to think of problems like a crumbling infrastructure and the effects that are going to come as a consequence of our inaction on climate change, then a $2 trillion amount doesn't even come close. I mean, it's like I said, embarrassingly inadequate. And here's some of the stuff that he has included in it. So EV stations nationwide, electric vehicle charging stations nationwide. That's good. I support that. Replace every lead pipe. Good. Universal clean drinking water. Fantastic. Needed, obviously, with the inaction on places like Flint. 2 million homes retrofitted or built. Need to obviously see more of the details come out on what that exactly means. Universal affordable high-speed broadband by 2030. Again, the details yet to be hammered out. That could be a great investment to make. I do believe that broadband internet should be considered as a public utility available to everyone free of cost, and we should regulate it in that sense. Fix 20,000 miles of roads and bridges. I mean, why are we setting these abstract standards here? Fix 20,000 miles of roads and bridges. The PRO Act included. So this is a big one. if the PRO Act, the Protect the Right to Organize Act, is passed through this process, along with all of the other things that are going to be included in this, that's pretty big. The PRO Act would be a game changer as far as the labor movement in the United States. It guards against exploitative practices or anti-union propaganda campaigns like the ones that we've seen waged recently by Amazon. And it does exactly what it says. It protects the right for workers to organize their workplaces. And that's a much needed thing in this country with like record low levels of unionization in this country. We need that desperately. So that would be gigantic and would really be the saving grace of this proposal that Joe Biden is putting forward. But that doesn't excuse the other sides of this, obviously, right? Just because you have the PRO Act included, that doesn't mean anything as far as investing in green energy. It doesn't mean anything as far as revamping our infrastructure. So that part of it would be the best part. But all of the rest of this is, I don't know. I don't know where he's getting these numbers from. That's the thing. And so just to give you an alternative of what, and by the way, the reason why he's being austere about this, the reason why he's pushing sort of an austerity mindset of like, well, I don't want to propose anything that's too big that's going to offset the deficit. This is classic Joe Biden mindset here. This is classic neoliberal mindset right here. You cannot have that mindset in a moment like this, okay? I promise you, it's objectively true that the amount, however much you're going to spend on investing in infrastructure, investing in protecting against the consequences of climate change, the cost of the effects of climate change down the road are going to exceed it by multiple times, okay? There's no amount of money that would be too much money to invest in combating climate change. This is the single greatest existential threat to the United States and to the rest of the world in human history. Okay, so it's not possible to overspend on tackling this problem. And by the way, while you're doing that, while you're, trying to prevent some of the worst consequences of climate change, you're also creating millions of good paying jobs. You're also creating, economic stimulus in this way. And that's if you go big. So here's what I want to just give you a perspective on. The Thrive Act. This is the Thrive agenda. I'll link it down in the description if you want to get into more of the details as to what they're proposing. So this is something that's being put forward by, some politicians, AOC, Ro Khanna. You see the list here, obviously like the Sunrise Movement and stuff. And they're saying, let's spend about $1 trillion a year over the next 10 years. $1 trillion a year over the next 10 years. By the way, Joe Biden's plan right now, that $2 trillion proposal, which he wants to basically offset with tax increases on wealthy people, which again, I don't think his tax proposal goes nearly far enough, but he wants to offset it with taxes. But in this act, it would be about $1 trillion a year over the next 10 years. Joe Biden's would be about 1% of our GDP per year over the next 8 years or 10 years or whatever it is. 1% of our GDP, 1% on an issue that is the single greatest threat to humanity right now, climate change. 1% of our GDP. Just as a perspective, like in the last year of World War II, we were spending 40% of our GDP on the war. 40% of our economy was the war economy. And I'm not saying we should spend 40% of our GDP. That's not what it would take. But what we should do is spend a lot more than 1% of our GDP on a threat that is just as big, if not greater, than the threat that was posed in World War II. So that's kind of the argument that they're putting forward here. And this would be about 1/8 of what we were spending at that time at the end of World War II. So $1 trillion a year over the next 10 years, that's not anything radical. It's what's needed. And again, it's not like that money's just going out the window. It's an investment. You're creating millions of jobs. You're stimulating the economy. You're creating different economic avenues with investments in these types of infrastructures. So this is the type of plan that you need to. Just a quick rundown here. The Thrive Act authorizes investment of at least $1 trillion per year. Honoring frontline leadership, the bill creates a Thrive Board of representatives from impacted communities, unions, and indigenous nations to guide the $1 trillion per year in new investments, economy-wide investments to take on injustice, pollution, and joblessness wherever we find it. The bill includes investments to upgrade our infrastructure for clean water, affordable public transit, and reliable electric grid, creating 5 million jobs, to expand access to wind and solar power, electric vehicles, and healthy buildings, creating 4 million new jobs, to protect our rural and urban spaces, wetlands, prairies, forests, and support family farmers who are embracing regenerative agriculture, creating 4 million jobs, and to invest in public institutions and care for children and the elderly, essential work that is unpaid, underpaid, and largely performed by women of color, creating 2 million jobs, respect for indigenous sovereignty, at least 50% of investments for frontline communities, strong labor equity and environmental standards, strong wage benefit guarantees and access to unions, et cetera, et cetera. So you can go read more of the details on this Thrive Act because it's really interesting, some of the specifics of the proposal that they're putting in. And this is the type of thing that we should be orienting towards. This should be the baseline. 10 trillion should be the minimum. I know it sounds like it's a lot, $10 trillion on paper, but it's over 10 years. It's $1 trillion a year. And it's not that radical, okay? This is what we need to be doing. Not acting boldly enough in this moment is way more of a threat than going too big in this moment. Oh, the threat of overspending in this moment is nothing compared to the threat of underspending on climate change, because this is the greatest threat that we have, not only to, our food supply lines, the future of mass migrations across the country with displaced people as a consequence of climate change. So this is something we can't go too big on. So they need to get together and they need to let Joe Biden know that this proposal is pathetically inadequate.